Hello, you're watching Smart Money, and joining me in conversation now is Renai Moothilal. He's Executive Director at NARCAM, which is the National Association of Automotive Component and Allied Manufacturers. Renai, thanks so much for your time today. And right at the top, for those who aren't familiar, talk us through the role the organization plays in South Africa's automotive component industry.
Alicia, thanks to you and your viewers for having me. NARCAM is the industry body for auto component manufacturers in South Africa. As you are aware, we have a fairly significant autos manufacturing kind of base with various OEM and assembly plants across the country. But those have to be serviced by a large number of component manufacturers. A vehicle is an assembly of its components, right? So the NARCAM membership effectively is those that supply both to the domestic OEM plants as well as global export and aftermarkets. The role of my particular organization, we are the mandated kind of industry voice of the component side of the value chain. By that I mean we at the forefront of industry representation, stakeholder engagement, industrial relations support. I think let me sum it up in a sentence. Our kind of core mandate at NARCAM is to positively impact the operating environment for auto component manufacturers in South Africa, and by doing so, contribute to the long-term success of autos manufacturing in the country.
Yeah. That said, Renai, I want to home in on a component. At the moment, industry focus is on the closure of ArcelorMittal South Africa's long steel production operations. This, of course, with AMSA, a core supplier of specialty steel and central to automotive manufacturing. How significant is this?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a hot topic, right? And I think it's not a new topic. The original kind of decision to exit from long steel production from AMSA was first back in November 2023, but a range of processes that happened in the interim that gave the industry some comfort that had been staved off. And to some extent, we were not fully prepared for the announcement that they made at the start of January this year. The impact is kind of obvious but significant. There's a immediate threat of job losses, not only at the AMSA plant, but at a number of component manufacturers. So other than the job losses, the loss of production into vehicle assembly plants means that you could run the risk of stopping an important, let's use Toyota as an example. You could stop the Toyota plant in production as they're not getting a particular component. You can't, as you would imagine, assemble 99% of a car. So the risk of stoppage of production, the employment associated with that, but more important, I think long-term positioning South Africa as a value-adding production for autos assembly gets harmed. Anything that hurts the competitiveness and the ability of our country to be seen as a significant producer of autos, you don't want to see happening.
Absolutely. Like you say, it is significant, so much so that government is scrambling to find a way to save the company's long steel operations, right? We've already seen the IDC throw the company a lifeline of about 380 million rand, and that to keep things going until the government finds a long-term solution. Has NARCAM, Renai, added its voice to what a potential sustainable solution looks like?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, I think NARCAM has been one of the stronger voices that have come through in the last month or so, particularly because I think it's our kind of companies that are what we call the kind of directly impacted. The vehicle assemblies themselves don't necessarily buy these long steel products. It's their component manufacturers who are in the NARCAM base. So our voice has been well ventilated, well heard, but it has been the case for a number of years. And I think the reason for that is we've identified already right now, if they had to have stopped production as of the end of January, there were at least 7 fairly large plants that would have closed, more than 3,000 jobs that would have been lost immediately. And our view was that toward the end of the year, you could have seen that number picked up to at least 13,000 direct jobs. So yeah, the voice was definitely heard. I think it was listened to. As a sector, our call has always been one of let's find an immediate kind of way of dealing with this crisis, and then let's also find a medium-term solution. The immediate way was to ensure that ArcelorMittal could commit to at least 12 months worth of prioritized production for the auto sector, which, if you listened to the results announcement by Corbis yesterday, they have committed to ensuring that there's sufficient stockpile for a 12-month period. But more importantly, I think we'd like to see both the company and the stakeholders involved, including government and ourselves as industry representatives, find a more medium-term solution that allows, let's call the asset. The asset is not ArcelorMittal. The asset in this case is the product coming out of that plant and the ability to service the auto sector. Let's find a way of ensuring that those particular special grades of steel continue to be produced somehow in South Africa.
And that's key, right? Because while a 1 billion rand rescue package for the company is what's being touted at the moment, AMSA has been pretty vocal about the fact that it itself isn't keen to invest new money into a sector that's hostile, that's unattractive as well, that structural changes are needed, relooking, for example, protective tariffs on imported steel. So to what extent are we looking at unfair trade and policy practices in play, and how quickly can we start to see, the structural change that's needed, structural reform come into play?
Look, I think the steel situation globally is one that, to some extent, also creates the situation that AMSA South Africa finds itself in that steel prices, steel supply globally, there's excess of it at the moment. So it means typically that you're competing with the imported product coming into the country. And AMSA is right. I mean, it's difficult for them given costs of infrastructure, logistics, the energy supply situation. There are valid reasons as to why they find themselves in the situation. So I do think there could be some policy support that comes on board. Some of the changes around export tax and scrap restrictions could assist AMSA. Ultimately, there are alternate solutions. For us as a sector, our message is just let's kind of be responsible. Let's ensure we've got sufficient timing. The one thing that I particularly am concerned about is, of course, we look to see as much finished component production here in South Africa. We call it localization. In SA, you've got a fairly big incentive that applies to autos manufacturing under something called the SA Autos Master Plan, which is planned until 2035. One of the objectives of that is a 60% localization level. Without belaboring the point, the component or the value chain side of things is where you extract the most economic benefit. And in order to get to 60% localization over time, you can't be then losing a key input material. I mean, why does it make sense to import something like steel, do some level of finished production here in South Africa, pay that high logistics premium, when you could, as an OEM, you could simply import the component, right? So our plea is one of, we need to find immediate kind of solution to the raw material supply thing, but we also don't want the vehicle manufacturers to say, oh, it's too expensive or it's going to take too long to regrade the raw material. So let us just bring the finished component into South Africa, and that's also a danger we're trying to mitigate against. So I think that's kind of our view consistently on how we should manage the situation.
Yeah, and that's answering in effect my next question, because there is this rule of thumb around steel supply being a competitive driver for automaking and industrialization, and it begs the question where on the one hand you're considering the kind of price inflation we're potentially seeing, on the other hand you've got this play out, but like you say, this is a longer-term sustainable story, economic growth story for South Africa that we've got to be looking at as well. What has to be considered is that while this impacts, like we said right at the top, the automobile manufacturers, it extends, Renai, to rail, to agriculture, to mining, power transmission. So AMSA's exit from the market will create this ripple effect throughout, the value chain within the automotive space, but other downstream industries as well. So cost to the South African economy that you're pricing in at this stage if we do not see a long-term solution being tabled?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's difficult for me to give it overall South African economy cost, but obviously I engage with a lot of the other sector bodies. I was giving you job numbers that I know directly in the auto space. When I look at some of my sector partners, you're talking about rail, some of the specialized construction, possibly defense producers as well. I think there's a fair estimate that the immediate job impact could be somewhere around the 100,000 mark. So there's definitely that impact. When I talk about localization in the autos economy, I mean, if I can just give you an example, when we started planning towards some of the targets around higher localization rate during the period of the master plan, if I look at approximately a 5% shift in that localization rate, so an additional 5%, according to our modeling, was something in the value of about 30 billion rand worth of procurement here in South Africa. Of course, that's made up of a range of components, but I mean, it can give you a sense of, as you start losing local content, what the rand value loss behind that is. So I think it's a fairly significant number. And ultimately, the auto sector is one that contributes more than 5% of the country's GDP and has been doing more than that for a fairly long period of time. I think autos products are close on, 30% of the total manufactured export base out of South Africa. So without sounding too much of an advocate of the sector, I do think from a manufacturing economy perspective, we cannot afford to do without autos manufacturing. And the government has made a decision that it wants to promote automotive manufacturing over a long term for what I believe are the right reasons. So you need to step up and go the full hog. And I think as stakeholders, we need to be clear that you can't have that vision and at the same time be losing key raw materials. I mean, you were talking about it. If I look at the data, what the technology in Newcastle is called a blast furnace, right? Countries like, I think those China, India, and Japan, in that order, have the highest number of steel blast furnaces globally. You can just do a very basic analysis. Look at how those countries' vehicles tend to dominate export markets. It's a pretty obvious corollary. So, I think it's definitely key that we maintain the competitiveness of domestic production and we maintain the raw material supply that has made us, to some extent, competitive over time. So why it's an important topic for us.
Absolutely, Renai. As we wind this conversation up, is industry having to fend off any other risks or, threats to South Africa's automotive component industry? Anything else blinging bright on your radar screen at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting time. Firstly, there's significant change of market dynamics, both here in South Africa and I think globally. Here in South Africa, we're currently dealing with a significant rise of imported, typically lower priced product from the East coming in. And I think the domestic manufacturers who my constituency tends to supply are losing greater and greater share of that domestic market. So the changing market dynamics, the change in technologies and ensuring that at least the vehicles coming out of South Africa, whether it's from an EV perspective, some of the higher end hybrids and the like, we need to capture greater parts of those kind of export markets. So from a market side of things, those are some of what's currently playing out. I do think that one of the more kind of interesting challenges that is currently kind of playing out is the state of geopolitics and trade relationships. If I just look at, for example, the discussions around what's happening in the relationship between the US and other trade blocs like China and the EU, the South African autos industry is significantly exposed to what happens in that space. So, for example, AGOA, one of the biggest subsectors that makes use of the AGOA arrangement into the US market is obviously the auto sector, including direct component exports. I mean, I don't know if you even know this, but we've got components that are produced here in South Africa, in Uitenhage, that find their way into the highest selling electric vehicle pickup in the US. And guess who the raw material supplier is? It's ArcelorMittal. So there's so many interrelated discussions that we could have on this point. But I think for me, the changes in market, what we're seeing on the trade related front, and of course, ongoing issues around the South African economy, growth rates, how do we deal with some of the infrastructure issues. I mean, it was really, really good to hear the president last night talking about the spend on infrastructure coming. All of those will add to a positive outcome for autos and I think general manufacturing in the country.
Absolutely. Well, Renai, what a pleasure it's been catching up with you today. Thanks so much for your perspective, sharing your insights with us as well. Renai Moothilal is, of course, Executive Director at NARCAM.
Thank you for having me.